The Romans knew how to entertain like no one else, capturing enemy warriors and forcing them to fight each other, staging battles between bulls and dwarfs or rhinos and tigers, digging out a special lake and organizing a naval battle with real ships and weapons. Everything that is forbidden today by criminal codes, moral standards, and common sense was a regular part of popular entertainment in ancient Rome, and even a state monopoly. The gladiator industry was a true show business, complete with its own PR agents, producers, and stars. Not all the stars survived, however. The first known gladiator fight took place in 264 BCE at the cattle market in Rome. It was organized by the sons of Decimus Junius Brutus Pera, who hired 3 pairs of fighters to honor their late father. The next similar event also commemorated a respected person and was also initiated by his sons. But this time, the scale was larger. Rather than at the market, it took place in the Roman Forum with 44 gladiators fighting. Originally, these fights were purely a funeral ritual, inherited by the Romans from the Etruscans. The ritual was called munus, meaning duty, but that was in the beginning. Gladiator fights quickly turned into grand spectacles with a political undertone. In Rome, influential families, factions, and parties were always vying for power, and gladiator shows became a part of that struggle. Gaius Julius Caesar, a known populist, loved using gladiator games to gain popularity among ordinary Romans, seizing any opportunity for it. For example, he once organized games to honor his father, even though his father had been dead for about 25 years by then. On another occasion, Caesar even had a lake dug on the field of Mars to stage a naval battle. Another popular general, Lucius Aemilius Paulus, put on a show where enraged elephants trampled condemned deserters. Emperor Augustus boasted of hosting games featuring 10,000 gladiators over 8 separate events, including 26 games with animals, resulting in the deaths of 3,500 animals. Emperor Claudius organized a battle between 2 fleets on Lake Fucine, with 19,000 people fighting on both sides. On another occasion, he reenacted the siege and sacking of a city. For the crowds, there were many casualties, of course, but those who survived earned their freedom. Without Netflix or many other forms of entertainment, ordinary Romans had few spectacles, and such grand shows were rare. At the same time, these events were expensive. A fortune was spent on slaves alone. If a politician was willing to pay for such a blockbuster out of his own pocket, it was clear to Roman citizens that he was a generous man who loved the common people and deserved their support. But none of this applied to the gladiators themselves. It was a disgraceful profession, seen as men selling themselves in the arena like a woman in a brothel. Gladiators were slaves, essentially living in prison, and rarely lived past the age of 30. Yet many became the stars and sex symbols of Rome. Noble women took lovers among them, which poets mocked, but to no avail. The Emperor Nero might give an estate to a skilled fighter. The philosopher Seneca called the bloody fights a dull and brutal pastime. Yet he continued to attend them. At first, fighters were recruited from conquered nations. Legionaries forced captives to fight each other as a test. Those who survived were sent to the arenas. Various conquered peoples became the prototypes for various gladiator archetypes, such as the Gauls, Samnites, and Thracians. There were even Hoplomachi, who represented the Greek hoplites. Over time, the gladiators began to include condemned men and slaves. Those sentenced to death were offered 5 years of gladiatorial combat as an alternative, considered a somewhat equivalent punishment. Occasionally, free men would volunteer to fight in the arena out of poverty or debt. Becoming a gladiator meant entering a school, which was essentially a specialized prison. Fighters lived in small cells for 1 or 2 people, often covered in graffiti with vulgar themes. There weren't many differences from a real prison, the main difference being that a successful performance might reward a gladiator with a visit from a woman. There were many schools, but the 4 most famous were the Great, the Morning, the Dacian, and the Gallic. Each could house thousands of gladiators and functioned as quasi-military states within the state. To begin, a new gladiator's owner would make them swear an oath, recognizing themselves as a slave and granting the right to be beaten and tortured. This procedure was mandatory even for those born free. After that, the training began. Their life now consisted of physical exercises, practicing moves on dummies, and a few intense highlights each year when they were released into the arena. Usually, they fought against their fellow schoolmates. The trainer would assess a fighter's potential and train them in one of the combat styles. Experienced gladiators often attempted to master several styles, up to 6 in some cases. A gladiator school was a well-organized sports complex, complete with a steward, an accounting office, an armory, a morgue, and even a hospital. The great physician and thinker Galen honed his skills while working as a medic in a gladiator school. It was from this experience that he famously said that wounds and fractures were windows to the body. It could be said that his patients were lucky. Only 5 of them died on his operating table, compared to 60 under his predecessor. Gladiators were fed cheap and unappetizing food, but in sufficient quantities to build them up for battle. Bone analysis shows that their diet consisted mainly of barley and beans, with meat being a rare treat. The ancient Romans mockingly referred to gladiators as barley boys. For a free citizen, such food was considered lowly, but it was relatively cheap and allowed weight gain, even adding a small protective layer of fat. This did not mean that gladiators were lazy or overweight. Ancient depictions show stout but agile warriors. Writers of the time unanimously described them as muscular men, not the lean athletes we see in modern films, but powerful, compact figures. Over centuries, the gladiatorial industry became as well organized as modern sports events. A gladiator owner acted as the manager of his fighters, establishing connections with curators, the organizers of the battles. The curators, in turn, had ties with the patricians who acted as producers. It was the nobility and emperors who funded the games, presenting them as gifts to the people of Rome. Over time, the government increasingly took control of the fights. Caesar owned several gladiator schools, and their graduates were considered among the best in Rome. Augustus even established a state monopoly on the business. However, small private promoters remained. Patricians could still hire a few gladiators for their feasts. Preparations for the big fights began months in advance. Curators hired fighters and launched intense publicity campaigns. Posters and advertisements, often featuring full-length portraits of gladiators, were common. The amphitheaters themselves were lavishly decorated. Nero, for example, had the arena sprinkled with moonstone and bought Baltic amber to decorate the net that protected the front rows of spectators. For animal shows, a forest of potted trees could be constructed. Entrance to the Colosseum for visitors was controlled through tokens made of ivory, terracotta, or metal. These tokens were distributed to notable residents of Rome and handed out by organizations as a form of social support. Naturally, tokens were forged, gifted, lent, and often stolen. The shows were held in 2 stages. The first part featured performances with animals, often in elaborate scenarios. Criminals would be exposed to lions, bears, and other dangerous animals, or bulls might be pitted against rhinos, and hunts could be staged in an improvised forest. After an intermission during which acrobats performed, the main attraction, gladiator combats, would begin in the afternoon. From a show business perspective, gladiatorial combat was in many ways similar to modern professional wrestling. Famous gladiators had catchy stage names that evoked fear: the Blade, Allure, the Lover Hero, or Humor, the Noble One. Fighters had fan bases and performed with fixed personas. People often supported a particular class of fighters. There were around 20 different types of gladiators, broadly divided into heavily and lightly armed categories. The Romans favored fights between 2 opposing fighters. A particularly popular pairing was the secutor and the retiarius. The secutor wore protective armor, including a rounded helmet with small eye slits, a large scutum shield, greaves and arm guards, and fought with a short gladius sword. His opponent, the retiarius, wore almost no armor, relied on speed and agility, and was armed with a trident and a net, symbolizing a fisherman, while the secutor played the role of the fish. Other types of gladiators represented nations defeated by Rome. The Thracian, from what is now the Balkans, wielded a curved sword. A chariot-riding gladiator played the role of a Celt. There were even more exotic types, such as those encased in heavy armor with helmets that had no eye slits, forcing them to fight by sound alone. In the movie Gladiator, the protagonist wields two swords. This class of fighter also existed. The finishing blow to a defeated gladiator was the climax of the show, and many myths surround this moment. Contrary to popular belief, the audience did not vote by pointing thumbs up or down. The decision was made based on the volume of the crowd's shouting, either calling for mercy or, conversely, shouting, "Cut his throat," while gesturing to their necks. Usually, a defeated fighter was spared, especially if he fought valiantly. Initially, the odds of dying in such situations were 1 in 9, but during the late Empire, when the crowd grew more bloodthirsty, the odds increased to 1 in 3. Typically, the death blow was delivered between the shoulder blades to pierce the heart. Occasionally, a slave dressed as an Etruscan underworld demon would come out and crush the defeated fighter's skull with a massive hammer. The most famous gladiators, Spartacus, Flamma, Spiculus, and Commodus, exemplify the range of gladiatorial fates. Spartacus, a freeborn Thracian who was enslaved and sold to a gladiator school, became a star in the arena. His fame was so great that other fighters chose him as the leader of the gladiator rebellion. Another example is Flamma, devoted to his craft, who fought in 34 documented matches, winning 21 and drawing 9. He was offered the symbolic wooden sword, signifying freedom, for times, but chose to remain a gladiator each time, eventually dying at the respectable, for his profession, age of 30. Spiculus, a secutor loyal to power, was rewarded by Nero with a palace and slaves. When Nero was overthrown, Spiculus suffered. An inventive mob crushed him with a statue of the emperor. The most infamous figure was Emperor Commodus, seen in the movie Gladiator. As a gladiator, he took part in 735 rigged fights, which he always won. There were even rumors that Commodus' mother had an affair with a gladiator. Ironically, Commodus was killed by a gladiator, but not in the arena. His sparring partner Narcissus strangled him. Animal spectacles were no less grand. The arena hosted fauna from across the known world. Bears from Scotland, moose from Northern Europe, elephants, hyenas, panthers, giraffes, ostriches, and rhinos from Africa, and tigers from India. Spectators could watch unique battles like rhinos fighting bulls, dwarfs wrestling ostriches, hunts involving giraffes or elephants, or trained monkeys dressed as soldiers riding goats. Some animals even became famous, such as a white rhinoceros from the 80s AD, celebrated in poetry and depicted on coins and paintings. The scale of these events was immense. In the opening games of the Colosseum, 9,000 animals were killed. Decades later, the 123-day games celebrating the conquest of Dacia saw the deaths of 11,000 animals. Hunting and capturing these creatures became a huge undertaking. Soldiers captured some. One centurion famously captured 50 bears with his unit, while hunting guilds secured others. Meat from the slain animals was raffled off to the citizens, with the most prized parts, such as ostrich brains or elephant hearts, adorning the emperor's table. Tusks and skins were sold to bolster the Roman treasury. Perhaps this grandeur helps to explain our continuing fascination with the Roman Empire. After all, what other era could have featured little persons fighting ostriches while people enjoyed